Imagine for a second that you have a net worth of $30 billion. You own private jets, a fleet of gold-plated cars, and enough cash to buy a small country. You are the most feared person on the planet. What tonight, you aren't sleeping on 3,000 thread-count sheets in a mansion overlooking the ocean. Instead, you're huddled on a thin plastic mattress in a mountain hut with no running water, eating canned beans and listening for the sound of a drone overhead. This is the reality of being a cartel kingpin. The world thinks of drug lords as kings of luxury, but the truth is far grimmer. Their lives are a progression of smaller and smaller cages until eventually they end up in a 10 by 10-foot concrete box in Colorado or Mexico, where the sun is a luxury and human contact is a memory. This is the paradox of the golden cage. We're going to look at why the most powerful men in the world choose a path that leads to total isolation, and why, for a billionaire narco, a prison cell might actually be the first place they've felt safe in years. To understand the end, we have to look at the peak. When we think of names like Pablo Escobar or Joaquin El Chapo Guzmán, we think of the excesses. Escobar had a private zoo with hippos. El Chapo had a diamond-encrusted pistol. But these are the highlight reels. The daily life of a top-tier cartel leader is a masterclass in paranoia. Once you reach a certain level of power, you stop being a person and start being a target. You are hunted by the DEA, the CIA, the local military, and perhaps most dangerously, your own lieutenants who are tired of waiting for their turn at the top. This means you can never stay in the same place for more than 2 nights. You can't use a cell phone. You can't visit your mother. You are a billionaire who's essentially homeless. Think about El Chapo's final years on the run. He wasn't living in a penthouse. He was hiding in the rugged Sierra Madre Mountains, moving through a series of interconnected tunnels and safe houses that were stripped of all comfort. His life was defined by the clack of a helicopter rotor. When he was finally captured in 2016, he wasn't caught in a palace. He was in a standard motel room looking exhausted. For these men, the freedom of the outside world is actually a high-stress prison of its own making. They are surrounded by hundreds of armed guards, but those guards are also their potential assassins. Every meal is tasted for poison. Every woman they meet is a potential informant. When you are that powerful, your world shrinks to the size of your security perimeter. Now let's talk about what happens when the run ends. For most high-level kingpins, the ultimate destination is a place called ADX Florence. It is known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, and it is the only place the U.S. government feels confident holding someone like El Chapo. In a 2D world, imagine a floor plan that looks like a maze designed by someone who hates people. The cells are 7 feet by 12 feet. The furniture, the bed, the desk, the stool, is all made of poured concrete. It can't be moved, it can't be broken, and it can't be used as a weapon. This is the 10 by 10 cage. It is a masterpiece of psychological engineering designed to provide total quiet. But in the world of corrections, total quiet is a polite way of saying sensory deprivation. In these cells, there is a single window, 4 inches wide and 4 feet high, angled toward the sky so the prisoner can't even see the ground or the horizon. They have no idea where they are in the complex. They spend 23 hours a day inside that box. This is a far cry from the mountains of Sinaloa or the streets of Medellin. Why would anyone risk this? The answer lies in the sunken cost of the narco trafficker. By the time a leader realizes the cage is closing in, they've already committed too many crimes to ever turn back. There is no retirement plan in the cartel. You either die or you go to the box. But wait, it gets even more complicated. There's a weird phenomenon where some cartel leaders actually prefer a Mexican prison over being on the run. In Mexico, prisons like La Palma or Puente Grande were essentially headquarters for the cartels. This is where the term the golden cage truly originated. In the early 2000s, these men would enter prison and immediately bribe every guard from the warden down to the janitor. They had cell phones, fine wine, prostitutes, and even office equipment to continue running their empires. El Chapo's first escape was famously done in a laundry cart, but the real story is that he basically owned the prison for years before he decided to leave. For him, the 10 by 10 cell was just a satellite office with free security. However, the game changed when extradition became the primary tool of the US and Mexican governments. Extradition is the narcos' greatest fear. There's a famous saying in the underworld, better a grave in Colombia than a cell in the United States. Why? Because in a US supermax, your money is worthless. You can't bribe a federal guard who makes a comfortable salary and faces 20 years in prison for taking $100. In the US system, the golden cage loses its gold. It becomes pure cold steel. Let's dive into the psychology of why these leaders don't just take their billions and disappear to a non-extradition country. People often ask, if I had $1 billion, I'd be on a beach in the Maldives and no one would ever see me again. But you aren't a cartel leader. To reach the top of a cartel, you have to be a narcissist of the highest order. You have to crave power more than you crave safety. These men don't want to be anonymous. They want to be kings. If they moved to a remote island, they'd be nobody. They stay in the game because the game is their identity. They would rather be hunted in the mountains than be a ghost on a beach. This ego is exactly what builds the walls of their future cell. Every decision a kingpin makes is a trade-off. They trade their privacy for power, their family's safety for wealth, and eventually their physical freedom for a legacy. But the legacy is a lie. When you look at the life of someone like Ociel Cardenas Guillen or Dairo Antonio Usuga, better known as Otoniel, you see a pattern. They spend decades building an empire, and then they spend the rest of their lives in a room where they have to ask permission to use a toothbrush. The sheer scale of the waste is staggering. Billions of dollars generated, thousands of lives lost, all so one man can sit in a concrete cube and stare at a 4-inch strip of sky. Now let's pivot to the pattern interrupt here. Think about the logistics of that cell again. At ADX Florence, even the meals are delivered through a slot in the door. There is no mess hall. There is no yard time with other prisoners. If they get to go outside, it's in a small outdoor cage, alone, for 1 hour. They are essentially living in a vertical coffin. The irony is that the technology we use to keep them there is often less sophisticated than the technology they used to run their cartels. While they used encrypted BlackBerry servers and semi-submersible submarines, their downfall usually comes from something as simple as a phone call to a family member or a craving for a specific type of street taco. The bigger the empire, the more points of failure it has. So why does the cycle continue? If every cartel leader knows that the 10 by 10 cage is the inevitable finish line, why is there always a line of people waiting to take the job? Because the golden part of the cage is very bright. To a young kid in a poor village, the 10 years of living like a god outweighs the 40 years of living in a box. They see the gold-plated pistols and the music videos, but they don't see the 4-inch window. They don't see the concrete bed. They don't see the reality that once you enter the golden cage, the door only opens one way. The story of the golden cage isn't just about crime and punishment. It's a study in human nature and the price of extreme ambition. It reminds us that freedom isn't about how much money you have in the bank, but about how much space you have to move. A billionaire in a 10 by 10 cell is still just a man in a box. In the end, the very systems they built to protect their wealth, the layers of security, the isolation, the secrecy, become the blueprints for their prison. They build their own cages long before the handcuffs ever click shut. As we look at the modern landscape of organized crime, the cages are getting smaller and the technology to monitor them is getting better. The era of the socialite narco is over. Today's leaders are even more invisible, even more isolated, and even more trapped by their own success. They are prisoners of their own empires, waiting for the inevitable day when the mountain hut is replaced by the concrete room. If you found this breakdown of the narco psychology and the reality of high-security isolation fascinating, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We're diving deep into the hidden structures of the world every week, using minimalist animation to tell the stories that are too big for the screen. Let us know in the comments, if you had $1 billion but had to spend the rest of your life in a 10 by 10 room, would you take the deal? Most people say no, but history shows there's always someone willing to step into the cage. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.